So, gentlemen, I've managed to find a cable for my cheap photo camera, and that means that this is time for some exiting tales. As I already said, my late grandpa served in Militsiya, translator's note, name for police forces in the Soviet Union and many Warsaw Pact countries, in the Soviet Union until the very end of the 90s. To be more precise, he was an inspector in the Seoul Militsiya station in a small town near Moscow. He was a very tight-lipped, solemn man, but when you asked him about his work he usually became more talkative. In my opinion, work was the only thing he loved in this life. So when I was younger, I was interested in paranormal stuff. Even back then, I spent a lot of evenings in his kitchen, inquiring about the most interesting cases of his career. After my grandfather died, I've found a thick notebook that he apparently used as a diary of sorts that he kept in his personal cabinet. In that diary there was a collection of his most, let's say, curious cases. I've managed to get this diary from my grandma a few times, and reading it I was always thinking about my grandpa as of some mathematician. No literature style, no personal opinions. Only confirmed cold facts, such as place where corpse was found, a criminologist's evaluation, suspects and stuff like that, a few theories and a couple of notes. I think he kept working on these cases in his free time, trying to solve these riddles. Most of his notes correlates with stories he told me when I was a child, but there were also few that I never heard about. In case you suddenly enjoy some of these stories, I might even pay a visit to my grandma and ask her to let me flip through a few pages of that diary, read up on some cases I am not familiar with, and make a few photos of the former scenes of crimes. Later we can even try to guess what happened there. As I have said, I wanted to write some sort of book about those cases, so I will provide you with some photos that I already got with some additional notes, but don't expect all of my photos to be of exact crime scenes, for obvious reasons. In some cases I was too chicken to enter particular houses, because neighborhoods here, as the town in general, are full of certain criminal elements, and if you enter some shitty hostel full of ex-cons and drug addicts you might simply never leave it. Also, some places got intercoms these days. I will also add that there will be no Popo Bawas, translator's note. Popo Bawa is an evil spirit from Zanzibar that is also a bit of a meme on Russian/X/ because this name sounds funny in Russian, something like ass joker, no colorful descriptions of monsters and stuff like that. Many cases have serious mystical undertones, but with some imagination you probably can explain them within a framework of habitual phenomena. But I can promise you a bit of noir, dismemberment, and romantic of piss-stained staircases in apartment complexes. Oh yes, I would also ask you not to get all booty blasted about quality of my photos. I am no photographer, and instead of proper camera I got this digital piece of crap. Well, let's start. This story also happened around '93 in that same small town near Moscow. I tried and failed to Google anything about it, and I've never heard anyone discussing it here in this town, so I guess there is no reason to give away the name, to be quite honest. My gramps worked in local militsiya, and I asked him about that case many times, so I guess I didn't completely imagine it, even though I was like 4 years old back then and my memories are a bit foggy. Back then, young women started to disappear in our town. Absolutely normal girls, not some criminal's girlfriends or anything, according to my grandpa. In a single month 6 of them disappeared in a single month. And then the 7th was lost. Her father was a trainer in a local boxing club, popular with both sportsmen and local thugs. From a whole bunch of his clients and friends who were willing to help him, he created some sort of militia patrol aimed at looking for his daughter and preventing similar abductions in the future. This militia started to stroll around the neighborhood in small groups, and one night I woke up from some loud noises from the outside. I ran to my window and saw my mother and father standing there, looking at a bunch of guys who were trying to widen some tiny cellar window that was right under mine, first floor, with sledgehammers. Now for some facts from my gramps. Guys from one of those partles saw 3 guys carrying something big towards that cellar. They immediately ran after them, but those 3 guys have managed to close the heavy steel cellar door before they were caught. Later I learned that they also built a barricade from some garbage lying inside when they realized that guys from militia are not joking. So, the militia guys called all the others and broke into the basement through that window, where they found those 3 crazy sickos armed with knives and girls' already dismembered body. I know now that there was also a handwritten book in unknown language, It was later apparently lost or stolen right from the evidence box, a hacksaw for metal and a dog's skull. Walls and floor was covered in some symbols written in chalk, which were mostly destroyed under the feet of 24 boxers who entered that basement, but nothing of value was lost, I guess. By the time cops arrived, those 3 guys were already heavily beaten by the boxers. 2 of them got crippled for life, 1 actually died. Few boxers received some superficial cuts. Interrogation by raging father gave no results, same as latter interrogations by Militsiya. Many traces of blood were found in that basement though, from different people and from a long period of time. As you can expect, no bodies were found even though search parties combed through every neighborhood in a nearby forest. The 2 survivors kept their silence. Come to think of it, those guys were some sort of screwed in the head neat necromancy cosplayers or something, and even they managed to hide those bodies very well. Imagine what smarter person with no mental issues could do. First case I want to tell you about happened in '93, and it is particularly interesting because no one managed to explain what happened there. I will add a few photos to this post. First has an apartment complex where it happened, second, an exact place where body was found, second stairwell, between the 3rd and 4th floors if you absolutely must know. So, around 10 o'clock in the evening, an investigatory operative group, in this small town it consisted of just random regular cops, but usually had an investigator, translator's note, Soviet/Russian analog of a detective rank, and an expert criminologist, was called in on report about discovery of a corpse. And this is what they saw on that staircase: a human body leaking a crapload of blood, head separated from torso and lying not far away. Lacerations look as if someone chewed him, according to my grandpa. His clothes, that consisted of training pants, sweater, and slippers, torn in a dozen of places, also some smaller injuries on his naked skin. It was instantly obvious that this corpse was fresh, which was confirmed by criminologist on the scene. Rigor mortis hasn't set in yet, which indicated that less than 2 hours passed since the moment of death. This was confirmed later, during the interrogation of victim's inconsolable widow, who lived on the 4th floor and whose door was like 3 meters from the body. By the way, she was the one who actually found and reported the corpse. The widow was clearly an alcoholic, and already had time to get wasted, but nonetheless she did provide some information. Her husband left the flat at around 9:30 in the evening to take out some garbage. When 15 minutes passed, she started to worry that he decided to stop and chat with his drinking buddies who usually sat near the entrance of the apartment complex, drinking. Windows of their flat provided no overview of the yard outside, if I recall correctly, so she decided to go downstairs herself to look for him. But the moment she left her flat she saw disfigured body of her husband in pool of blood. She failed to provide any more details during the later questionings. Now for the interesting part. Interrogations of other inhabitants of that complex provided literally no additional information. Not a single one of them heard any ruckus, screams or sounds of fighting. Nothing. And that is considering the shitty non-soundproof doors people had back then. There was also indeed a bunch of drunkards sitting on a porch downstairs. According to them, they were hanging out there since around 8 in the evening, and in all that time only some old lady, who lived on the 1st floor, and a single mother, who lived on the 2nd, entered the complex. Both of them also heard and saw nothing. During that time, not a single person left the complex. By the by, my grandfather almost instantly suspected some sort of large dog. What else could dismember person in such a manner in the middle of civilization? Later investigation revealed that there were 2 dog owners in that complex, but their dogs were not nearly big enough to inflict such wounds, which was also later confirmed by the coroner. Head was indeed separated from the body as if with the teeth of a large animal. His spine was literally grinded in places. Also, one of his legs had very clear markings of jaws. According to coroner, it looked very deliberate, as if left there intentionally. Every single tooth of both lower and upper jaw left a clean mark, which almost never happens in normal coroner's practice. That one sure never seen such a thing. Jaws indeed were similar to dogs, but a really big one, and there were 48 of those teeth marks there, while normal dogs only have 42, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less, but rarely and not by much. Now couple of my own comments. Large dog is indeed capable to separate grown man's head from his body in 15 to 20 minutes. I can confirm this as an owner of a large dog. No, my dog didn't kill anyone, but can chew through a large bone in around 10 minutes. But there would be a crapload of noise and shouts. Okay, if dog somehow managed to rip that guy's vocal cords on the first bite, there wouldn't be many shouts, which I guess is possible, considering the size of those jaws. But how could no one notice a huge ownerless dog entering/exiting the apartment complex? Such animals tend to be remembered. Another strange thing is that blood was only found near the body. There was no blood on the stairs themselves, neither above nor below. As if he was first put on the floor and then got his head calmly chewed off in silence. My dog attacked a homeless dog once. There was a lot of blood, it was freaking dripping from its jaws and chest all the way home, and let me remind you that human has much more blood than a dog. Nothing like that here, everything is crispy clean. So we have something big that appeared on the staircase between the floors. That house had no garbage chute. If you would like to entertain such a wild theory of its method of movement, silently chewed grown man's head off, left a dozen injuries on his body without any signs of resistance, and then disappeared. So it goes. Officially the case was explained by a wild dog attack and closed the hell down, not before informing all the local dog catchers that they should do their work better in the future. I just stumbled upon those photos, so I guess I'll tell you about them. I have to warn you that some people might not find it too scary, but this case always captivated me. There is something about it. Also, when I once saw some tiny lights in that wood at night, I figuratively shat my pants. It will be longer than the first one, but do prepare yourselves, for I have no freaking idea how long the third one will be either. It happened in the winter of '95. One evening, around 8 o'clock, a strange visitor came to a local Militsiya station, a priest of the local church, which, by the way, happens to be in the middle of freaking nowhere. He came to report threats he has been receiving for some time now. Priest brought a bunch of notes with him, which were written on torn notebook pages in crooked block letters. They were written with a bunch of mistakes that desk cop on duty that night had a field day with. But he didn't laugh for long. According to Priest, he regularly received those notes in his mailbox, first every 3 days, later, every day, which was the reason he decided to finally report them. After being asked if he wanted to add something else to his report, he hesitantly added that recently he started to hear the sound of slaps in his apartment. As if someone was slapping linoleum in his corridor and kitchen with bare hands, very distinctly. When asked if he actually checked what it was, he answered that he was too scared to leave his room and just prayed to God, hoping for his protection. He was clearly worried that people would think that he is just insane, and people at the station indeed thought so, but his report was officially accepted nonetheless. It was a busy period for Militsiya, and since Priest didn't look well in the head, the case and those notes were forgotten for a time. Around a week later, an investigatory operative group gets a call. In the forest, around 200 to 250 meters deep, on the glade you can see on the first photo, a body was found. And not just some body, but, as you have probably guessed, body of that very priest. State of that corpse was pretty fucking terrible. Almost all of the muscular tissue on his hands and legs was missing, body was covered in livor mortis and blemishes. Facial features were distorted by the rot. He was only recognized so quickly thanks to his cross, which was the only element of clothes on him, long hair and beard. Later it was concluded that he died 7.5 to 8 days before the discovery. Additionally, his body clearly was kept indoors for some time, since it wouldn't have rotten so much in the winter frost. It was confirmed by the elderly guy who found the body, since he used to walk with his dog every day on the same route in this forest and only discovered body that morning. Also, which was especially bizarre, many prints that were found around that body looked like the prints of human hands. They didn't look like handprints, they were the handprints. It was just so damn ridiculous at that point, quoting my grandfather. There was a trail of such prints leading around the forest, strangely enough, not on the cleared trail, but around it, in the snowdrifts. There was no evidence of body being dragged, all the other prints belonged to that elderly guy and cops. Previous night there was a serious snowfall, which would have covered the tracks, so body clearly wasn't there for long and it clearly didn't happen to appear there by itself. Questionings of the elderly guy, residents of the nearby houses and guards of a garage cooperative close by didn't clarify much. Though the elderly guy kept nagging about finding corpses of animals on that glade, dogs, cats, rats, crows and such. He reported it to Militsiya many times, but nothing was done about it and he had to bury animals himself. He also just had to share his theory about Satanists with the investigators. The place itself was far away from anything. The closest houses were like 600 to 700 meters away, same as that garage cooperative. No cars stopped nearby, no mysterious people were seen there, not even ordinary people with a big bag or parcel. Literally fuck all. And that's when someone remembered about the notes. Earlier notes were rather simplistic, basically threats like, reject your faith or we will kill you. But those that came later were a bit more interesting. Take off your cross or you will feed the hungry one with yourself, my grandfather quoted from his memory. There was more, but he didn't recall what those were about, sadly. All of them had a bunch of mistakes, as I already stated. No handwriting expertise was done, to my knowledge, but those notes were quickly given away to experts in order to check for fingerprints, while investigators decided to visit Priest's flat. Door wasn't closed, though there were no signs of forced entry. Remembering Priest's words about slaps on the floor, linoleum in his corridor and kitchen was checked, without much hope, for fingerprints. But his was a sudden success, a few clear handprints. Huge fingers certainly were not the Priest's. Fingers looked like they belonged to some hammerer or a smith, according to my grandfather. Other than that, everything in his flat looked in order. All the obvious valuables, like the icons, were still there. But there was no way to know for sure, since that priest lived alone and had no relatives, being an orphan. In short, fingerprints on the notes were identical to those on the floor, but neither the local Militsiya station, nor the bigger regional archive had those prints in their databases. Meanwhile, coroner report stated that muscles in his hands and legs weren't eaten by the animals, but neatly removed with surgical accuracy, using either scalpel or a small and very sharp knife. No additional wounds were found on his body, no traces of known poisons were found either. Militsiya had to start questioning members of Priest's church parish. He wasn't seen there since the day he reported death threats to the local station. Obvious conclusion was that he disappeared after visiting it, since it happened after the evening service. So it happened either on his way home, or at his flat, considering it was found open. Questioning his neighbors revealed that he probably didn't come home that day. One old lady even came to his door at around 9 in the evening, to ask for some life advice, but no one opened. She didn't hear any suspicious sounds or seen any suspicious people either. It seemed to be a complete dead end. All the local invalids were checked, just in case. Investigators really tried to somehow work that strange handprint angle. At first they started to check those who lived nearby. And after Chechnya and Afghanistan there were many. By the end of it, Militsiya checked almost all town's invalids, but found no fingerprint matches. They didn't really expect any results at that point, to be honest, so they just wrote it off to probable local cultists, which was really easy to do back then because of the story that happened when I was a child. Even those 2 guys that were caught 2 years ago were questioned, but to no avail. Maybe it was their friends doing or something, but I doubt it, since modus operandi seems too different. Of course, if Priest wasn't largely ignored when he came to the station, he probably could have told them something else, and that info might have resulted in a solved case, but we have what we have. And it really smells of some mysticism, in my opinion. By the way, here's another photo of that place made at around 11 in the evening. Those little lights, that I told you about in the beginning. Zooming didn't result in anything, and the flash on my camera was so freaking bright that I got scared and decided to leave that place in case I was seen. Not that I am a coward, but you know, that forest becomes really creepy when you know this story. The lights are around the place where the glaive is. Those are certainly not cigarette lights, too far away to be seen so clearly. Possibly small campfires of motorcycle lights, there is no way to get a car there. It remains a mystery. So, gentlemen, let's go further. There probably won't be much paranormal sounding stuff in this one, since real question here is not how someone would do this, but why the hell would someone do this? Let's go. It happened in 91, which was a hard time. Levels of apathy and general unprofessionalism in Russia were off the charts back then, which played a role in this case. No one was sure about tomorrow and future of their country. It all began with a call from a very bad address for a very shitty reason. Apartment complex where it all happened can be seen on a photo I add to this post. For as long as I can remember, this particular place was always considered bad and dangerous. But not because it had ghosts or some shit like that, of course. Reason was much simpler. It was a former dorm, that in those times was filled with people from the very bottom of society. Robberies, knifings and murders happened there regularly. Even I had a chance to see local, so to say, customs personally when I was a kid. I was riding my bicycle nearby when a human head flew out of some window and landed around 30 meters away from me. According to rumors, some drug addicts had an argument. But anyway, I am just telling this so that you would better understand what kind of atmosphere that place had and why I didn't go inside to make some photos for you. Yes, I pissed myself. Very interesting, and yes, very/x/thank you for translating. Getting back on the topic, in one of the flats on the second floor a family was murdered. Said family consisted of a single mother, her 7-year-old daughter and, as was found out later, a year-old infant. They were extremely poor, and, according to the old lady living in the next apartment, poor thing was nearly driven to a heart attack when she discovered the bodies. Mother held no job, drank non-stop and often brought some suspicious men home. Daughter was practically homeless and never went to any sort of kindergarten or school. How did infant manage to survive in such a family is unclear. According to Grandpa, you should divide anything those old Soviet grannies say by 2 if you want to get closer to the truth, but it all looked crappy nonetheless. The door was slightly ajar, which allowed for bodies to be found. As for the bodies, at the first glance, it looked like a typical case of domestic violence. With some excessive force, though. Around 30 knife wounds on each body. Wounds were at least 2 days old. Criminology experts' theory was that those wounds were inflicted on the already dead bodies. Mother was killed in the kitchen. Signs of struggle were all around. Furniture was overturned, fridge handle torn off, some dishes broken. A bottle of uncharacteristically expensive vodka and some rotting delicacies were picturesquely lying on the cheap, dilapidated table. Daughter, it looked, was killed in her sleep, because she was found in her bed in an embryo pose. No signs of resistance. As for the infant, no trace of him was found, except for a baby fence in his sister's room. Infant's very existence was only corroborated by that same old lady, and later other neighbors. No diapers, no baby food, no stroller, no birth certificate, nothing, which is, considering the social status of that family, could be possible. But even the surface search of the apartment revealed a lot of interesting things. Not only the freezer was chock full of expensive food and alcohol, there was also a very large sum of money hidden in the icebox. Literally a few packs of money hidden inside the cheap wrappings, which was a normal way to hide money and valuables from possible robbers those days. But what were they doing here in the apartment of these piss-poor people? That raised some questions, because connection between those valuables and deaths was obvious. Further questionings of the neighbors and local alcoholics in the yard clarified 3 important things. First of all, murdered woman was popular here, if you know what I mean, and her door was usually open. Second, according to a score of witnesses, a strange man started to visit her in the last week. He clearly wasn't local, and even though descriptions slightly varied from witness to witness, they painted a certain picture: uncertain age, completely bald head, always in a same brown 3-piece suit, patent leather shoes and a bow tie. In short, he looked like he was loaded with some dough. No one could provide investigators with any distinctive details of his physical appearance or face. Such people rarely, if ever, visited this place, and it is a whole separate question as to why didn't anyone try to rob or just beat him up. Cause that kind of people was not too popular in that house, to say the absolute bloody least. Many people saw him entering the apartment complex and victim's flat, but no one saw him leave. Another thing was suspect's interesting and unusual manner of speech. According to people who talked to him, it was florid, artsy, old-fashioned, and extremely polite. Sadly, no one could quite recall what that man asked them about, though all witnesses could recall that he had some questions, which wasn't completely unusual in such places, since inhabitants were usually drunk or on something. He was seen at least 3 times in the last week, though by the time Militsiya arrived he wasn't seen there for 3 days straight. And, finally, the third important piece of info, the moment this man started to come to this apartment complex, victim stopped to receive visitors, and her flat, for the first time in years, fell silent. No shouts, no loud noises, no baby cries. So yes, infant's existence was finally corroborated by the accounts of most witnesses, but no one remembered dead women ever being pregnant. Bodies then were brought to a coroner. When they were loading them into the car, it looked as if every bone in those bodies was broken, basically behaved like a couple of rag dolls. Further search of the apartment didn't provide investigators with any additional details, no signs of forced entry. No traces of blood except for those of the victims. The bottle of vodka and glasses on the table were, of course, checked for fingerprints, but only prints that belonged to the victim were found. Doorknobs in her flat gave such a wild range of different fingers, that experts exhausted themselves to no end just by comparing every set with what they had in their databases. In any case, almost all fingerprints belonged to local lowlives who haven't seen her for at least 2 weeks. Now, coroner's report was much more fucking interesting. Indeed, injuries on the bodies were inflicted when victims were already dead for around a day at that point. But this is not the interesting thing. Autopsy showed that every bone in their bodies, except for the skull and cervical vertebrae, became extremely brittle and were, basically heavily damaged by God knows what. They certainly weren't broken by the blunt trauma, since there were no traces of such damage on the bodies themselves, not to mention that it would be a very tiring process, breaking every tiny bone in human body. Also, bodies would look like a couple of torn bloody bags after that. Damage dealt to the bones reminded local Militsiya expert of the effects of highly concentrated hydrofluoric acid, but there were 2 big problems with this theory. First, hydrofluoric acid of such concentration would have left extreme fucking chemical burns. Considering that all of mother's and daughter's bones were heavily damaged, they had to take a bath in that acid to achieve such effect, but there were no surface traces of that. Second, this acid leaves such a chemical bouquet in human body, that tests would surely have identified it, but the only irregular thing about their bones was a critical lack of calcium, and that was that. At the same time the tests were conducted, a call came from one of the witnesses, interrogated earlier. He saw the suspect entering boiler house near that apartment complex. Not wasting any time, my grandfather got 2 operatives and moved out. Door to that boiler house territory was indeed open. Whether it was lock-picked by the suspect or just left unclosed by the sloppy workers was never found out, but according to all regulations that door must have been locked. On the photos you can see that very boiler house. Kindly forgive me for not trying to get inside. There is an actual lock hanging there now, and trying to climb over the concrete walls with barbed wire is not my idea of fun. So, Grandpa went there and met 2 middle-aged women working inside. By the way, there's supposed to be 5 or 6 personnel working at all times. According to regulations, this is probably the reason why something blew up inside when I was a kid. They were noticeably twitchy and were not acting normal, as if afraid. When questioned about the suspect, they nervously laughed and denied any knowledge about him. The way they tried to bullshit me was pretty cartoonish, according to my grandpa. But at that point my gramps didn't give much of a fuck about them, just left one of his operatives there to watch the main entrance and those 2. The other one of his subordinates he took with him to more effectively conduct the search of the area. By the way, building was pretty fucked up. It, as you can see from the photos, is very old and multi-tiered. So everywhere there was moisture, rust, and only 1 out of every 10 light bulbs was working, so they had to get the flashlights. In the far corner of that building, one that probably no one visited for years, baby's loose jacket was found, hanging between the interweaving pipes. Grandpa and his subordinate started to frantically search everywhere in the area. They literally looked under every single pipe in that building, but found nothing. Even the criminology expert who arrived later had no luck with fingerprints or any prints whatsoever. Baby's jacket had no traces of blood on it, or any other traces at all. It looked so clean as if it was just recently washed. 2 women were called later for questioning. One of them kept stating that she saw or knew nothing, and the other disappeared after the very first interrogation. As her melancholic drunkard of a husband said later, she just left home without even packing any of her belongings. Despite all the numerous questions Militsiya asked her husband and colleague, despite checking all possible connections, nothing gave any result. For all intents and purposes those women were completely normal. Even their fingerprints were taken and compared to those found in victim's flat, but this naturally ended with failure. At that point the case came to a grinding halt and it seemed that there was nowhere left to dig. Suddenly, a month later, another call came from the same apartment complex, from the same old lady who found the bodies. According to her, faint sounds of crying were coming from now sealed apartment where murders took place. Operative Investigatory Group answered the call. My Gramps told me that he almost physically felt surrealism of the situation. Sealed door of the dead apartment had no signs of forced entry, and Gramps indeed heard a faint sound of baby crying inside. It took them half an hour to get inside the apartment, and indeed an infant was found there. Only he had no eyes. I mean there was no blood or anything. Just no eyes. As was later found out, they were surgically removed from his sockets. A thin layer of pink skin was covering places where eyes should have been with tiny scars marking them, as if after plastic surgery. No injuries or pathologies beyond that were found. If you are curious about his fate, he was first brought to Children's Hospital, then to an orphanage for infants. I don't know what happened to him later, but I suggest he had a very unhappy life, though I am curious if anything else strange happened to him. So it goes, gentlemen. I am tired as fuck typing all of this. Translator's note, imagine what it's like typing and translating it, bitch, but I will add my grandpa's theory and a couple of my own thoughts nonetheless. His theory was that infant was basically bought from his alcoholic mother by that guy in a three-piece suit. But something went wrong with the deal and led to him killing the mother and the daughter as a witness. Method of murder itself was much less clear. Let's suppose knife wounds were either a way to lead the investigation on the wrong path, though murderer seemed too clever to think that they would fool the experts. Considering that he clearly knew how not to leave any traces of his presence, or mask a way that bone-damaging substance entered the body. Though injuries on both bodies seemed very random. Some parts of bodies were covered with injuries, while others were left untouched. And again, experts had no idea what kind of poison could have such an effect without leaving any traces. Next thing, who would leave such a huge sum of money to a corpse? There really was a fuckload of money there, and only some poor woman who drank away her brains could think that no one would find them. But fact is a fact, money was there. How to tie it in with those two women from the boiler house I have no fucking idea. By the way, the one that left never came back. My grandpa often returned to this case and checked for any new information about her possible whereabouts. I guess, someone managed to scare them really good. But there is no way to know now, really. And fuck if I know what that baby jacket was doing there. Next. The infant. Where did the victim get him? Was he stolen? Left on her doorstep? Scars from such things as eye removal don't heal in a mere month, as you might know. Was it some other baby, but how and why? Also, those who saw the child before all this happened, stated that he had a birthmark on the right side of his forehead. Baby with no eyes had exact same birthmark. I guess, getting inside the sealed apartment wasn't much of a challenge, since the killer might have had the keys. But even without all that, I think there are many mysterious things about this story. That's it. You might fling some shit at me, because this case didn't have much in terms of paranormal, but believe me, next case has it in spades. First of all, I have to disappoint you, cause the most paranormal story will have to be reserved for later. I didn't pick the best of times to go out and make photos. Not only I almost shat my pants because of some creepy dude there, but also visibility was shit. However, few of these photos will fit another story quite nicely. Use your imagination to envision the locales I am going to tell you about, cause some of these places are too far away / too creepy / don't exist anymore. Still, I think you will find this case to your liking. Here it goes. It's 92, the country is still shaken, my grandpa is still serving in Militsiya of our town. One day a weird guy comes to his station, acting all awkward and shy, obviously nervous. According to grandpa, he looked like a drunken bum in dirty, torn clothes. Despite his looks, though, he had both proper passport and a legal address. In short, he told them this, in one of the farthest and worst parts of town, that consisted of garage cooperative and an abandoned train depot. You can see the depot gates on the first photo. I have no fucking idea why does it glow green, but I guess it looks amusing. His friends started to go missing. By the by, I have no idea why that depot is even there. I've never seen a single train on those fucked up tracks in my life. Those people were not just some random guys, but true-to-life vagabonds who had some sort of spot there, where they hid from people's eyes. Also there was scrap and copper reception point nearby. Translator's note, selling stolen scrap and copper was an integral part of survival for many bums back in the 90s. That explains why they sent an emissary who actually had some legal papers instead of one of their own, because no one wanted to spend their night at the monkey house, TN, a slang term for a cell that houses drunks and bums, or used as a scapegoat to help Militsiya to close some dead cases. Which was, regrettably, a quite widespread practice back then. As he explained, something strange was happening there. Just 3 days ago, one of the bums walked away from the bonfire to take a piss and just never came back. Around 30 minutes later, his friends lit some sticks and went looking for him with those improvised torches. You never know, he might have fallen asleep in a ditch or something. But despite all their efforts, they failed to locate their friend, although drunk bums are not very good at nocturnal search operations, let's be honest here. Their friend didn't come back tomorrow or the day after tomorrow either. They didn't think much about it, especially because a full bottle of vodka went missing that night too, which, apparently, was a commodity valuable enough for them to justify their friend's sudden flight. He didn't take any of his stuff with him, so they were waiting for him to come back, ready to kick his ass. But on the next night another one of them went missing, under much more frightening circumstances. Similarly, one of them walked away from the bonfire to take a leak, but as soon as he left the circle of light provided by it and entered the bushes he let out a terrifying scream that was abruptly cut short. This prompted other bums to action as they rushed to his rescue. But at that moment, according to the emissary, they heard some sort of growl which made them stop in their tracks. He didn't see much himself, cause no one thought to prepare torches for such an occasion, but some of his friends claimed to see a scary person who was grinning at them from the darkness, barely dissipated by the weak light of their bonfire. To cut the long story short, they got really scared and went back to their bonfire, not daring to go to sleep till the morning. At that point, bums were forced to take extreme measures and ask for help from one of their sworn enemies, the Militsiya. Legally speaking, Militsiya had no basis to reject his report, so it was accepted, discussed during the smoke break and promptly dismissed as mad homeless ravings or some sort of prank. Cops had enough on their plate already. But next disappearance forced them to ponder and act. One of the town's citizens disappeared. A simple, regular guy who liked to drink and to drive around in his car in his free time. According to his wife, he was a responsible family guy who never left for a long time without warning. But 2 days have passed and there was no sign of him. By the way, hell if I know why didn't she report his disappearance after the first 24 hours passed. And the last place where he was seen was, you've guessed it, that very same garage cooperative, which situated near Bum's spot, where he left his car and went home using familiar and the shortest route, old railway tracks. Connecting his disappearance with those of Bum's was, of course, an obvious thing to do. As you can see on the photos, forest closely surrounds the tracks from the both sides. Similar situation is in the other direction, except there is a bridge there, that you can see on the photo. I decided not to climb that bridge, cause I saw a corpse lying there in my childhood, which didn't leave me with a lot of pleasant memories. That corpse itself is not interesting, typical story of the late 90s. After the bridge there is more forest on the right and concrete wall on the left, separating railway from old warehouses, were almost abandoned back then and by the mid-2000s they were demolished. After that, some sort of building materials market was constructed there, but by now it is abandoned too. I guess this place just have such fate. And so it goes like that for 1.5 kilometers till it reaches more or less civilized areas of town. At first, they suspected the bums themselves, obviously. But on the other hand, if any of them was guilty he would have run away after their emissary informed the Militsiya. But one operative was sent to question them anyway, although, he either was a dumbass or the bums left their usual place, because he didn't find anyone. Meanwhile, my grandfather took a group of subordinates and went to visit those old warehouses, which were the obvious place to hide potential bodies. Besides, at that point in time, there wasn't even a single security guard working there. Skipping the boring details, what they've found there was a checkered shirt with some traces of blood, that, according to missing guy's wife, was on him when he left home. In addition, there was a lot of various trash and a couple of mattresses. The room they found them in was relatively clean too, in comparison to the rest of the warehouse. Experts immediately detected some fingerprints there, and that's where a certain surprise awaited them. It was revealed that fingerprints belonged to two convicts who escaped from some prison near Solikamsk 15 years ago and were largely forgotten about by that point. By the by, they were imprisoned for some pretty heavy stuff, SA and something else, as far as I can remember. One of them was local, the other one used to live in Moscow. The local one was 62 years old, at that point, the one from Moscow, 41. Next logical step was to check the address where local escaped convict used to live. His flat was on the first floor in a pretty bad part of town. Apartment complex itself was in critical state, it has been demolished by now, and the flat itself belonged to town's housing fund for some reason. Khan would have been quite surprised if he chose to return home legally, I bet, but no one lived there anyway. It turned out that getting the keys wasn't a problem, since the door, a piece of plywood, was already broken into, the lock was torn out. Inside the apartment, or to be more precise, inside its bathroom, they've found, without any exaggeration, a fucking pandemonium. First, traces of blood were found on the floor and walls of the corridor. And in the bathroom itself there was a bath full of body parts, belonging to 3 people in total, though heads and torsos were never found, as far as I know, apparently chopped with an axe that wasn't ever found either. Those parts floated in dirty cold water, no idea where did they get it, since water supply to that flat was cut off long ago. Stench of decomposition and feces was horrible, toilet was literally covered in excrements, but neighbors didn't contact Militsiya, which was understandable since nobody lived on the first 3 floors, except for an ancient blind gaffer from the second. Kitchen had a portable gas stove, big tin can with traces of blood on it, half-full bag of potatoes and a pile of human bones just laying in the corner. This is when the realization hit the operatives. Khans, whose fingerprints were found everywhere around the apartment, were eating those people. Fuck if I know why and for what reason. I mean, you can just steal food, like those potatoes, but they were eating them. Everything pointed to this conclusion. Questioning the other tenants didn't give investigators anything new to go on. Those few who still lived there, less than 10 people in total, unanimously claimed that they have never seen any unfamiliar men there. But that blind old man said that night before Militsiya paid a visit to that flat, someone was trying to force themselves in his apartment for a few hours straight, but to no avail. Case was turning more and more serious by the minute. 2 operatives were left in the apartment to lay ambush, while my grandfather went straight to the prosecutor's office, demanding them to involve the federals. Because this case was clearly out of his league and he knew only too well who would have to answer for all this shit if it turned even more serious. Imagine that, a mass murder plus 2 wanted escaped convicts. Case was taken away from him surprisingly fast, almost no one there even tried to argue with him. 2 operatives, who spent the night in that flat and almost went mad from stench and disgust, were freed from their unpleasant duty, though murderers never returned to their apartment anyway. Everyone involved was thoroughly questioned by the feds. Grandpa himself and his immediate superiors got their asses kicked by them for sloppiness, but no one lost their office or got demoted. Who took this case over? What info I have left could be classified as rumors told during the smoke breaks, but if you start to tell the story, you have to finish it, even though I don't know all the details. Perpetrators' tracks were found not far from town, near a big forest that stretches for dozens of kilometers. There was a place there called the Lodge, even though it was, in fact, more of a country house cooperative consisting of something around 40 houses. My guess, call came from there. Federals failed to apprehend both of them, though, and here's why: they were already pursuing them through the woods, when suddenly they stumbled upon the older one, lying on the ground and grinning like a madman. Apparently his friend broke his leg with something heavy and proceeded to escape alone. He was dragged to a car and interrogated, but no one managed to squeeze out a single word out of him. He just kept whining and growling like an animal. The younger one was never found, even though a search party combed through the whole fucking forest with dogs. The older con kept whining and shaking all the way to the precinct, but at one point fell silent. It turned out he managed to gnaw his own tongue off. Doctors managed to save his life, again, according to rumors. He proved uncooperative, was officially recognized insane and got locked away in some specialized asylum for the rest of his days. Neither I, nor my grandpa could vouch for a single word in a previous part, as you can understand. But there is only one proper version of events, no mysteries here. 2 escaped convicts were fucking around somewhere for 15 whole years and managed to get from Ural to Moscow. They probably went through a lot in their travels. And at some point were forced to eat someone to avoid death from hunger, maybe another bum or just some random tourist. Apparently, this experience took a heavy toll on them psychologically, and they acquired a taste for human meat. After that, they switched to a new menu, slowly turning more and more into a couple of fucking animals if the older one is any indication. And only here, in the Moscow region, they became bolder and ate someone who would be searched for, because finding them, basically, wasn't really that hard. But there is another factor. They had almost animal-like sense of danger, always managing to outpace Militsiya's pursuit just by a day or two. That's it. By the way, it was really creepy, taking these photos, knowing that in theory one of them is still on the run. Even though he must be really old today, those locales now are as far away from any proper civilization as it was back then. Also, I would never want to be in shoes of that blind old man during that night. This part of the story always chilled me to the bone. This happened during the summer of '96. This case differs from the previous ones, because, firstly, it happened in a good part of town, in which I lived, by the way, and, secondly, because I heard part of this story firsthand, even before my grandpa told me about it. One night around 1 a.m., a man burst into my grandpa's precinct, raving like a lunatic and holding a crying woman in a torn dress. After managing to calm him down, officers on duty started to listen to his story. He, 32-year-old, small-time businessman, was visited by some friends that evening, and asked his wife, 27, housewife, to take their kid, 8-month-old, boy, and go for a stroll around the block. What kind of visit and from what kind of friends makes you ask your wife to take your child and leave the house at 11 p.m. is a separate question, and some investigators tried to tie this visit to what happened next and had certain success with it. After running some checks on those friends, who had pretty evident connections to a big local gang, he clearly paid them protection money, since both he and his business were doing fine, but I'll come back to it later. After around 1 hour and 10 minutes he finally managed to get rid of his friends and started to worry about his wife who hasn't yet come back. When he came out of the house he couldn't see her anywhere and started to circle their apartment complex, shouting her name, when suddenly he literally stumbled upon the overturned stroller, lying there in the dark. Stroller was lying on that asphalt road you can see on the first photo. There were no lanterns on that road back then, and there are none today. The closest ones are something like 30 meters away, near the walkway lying along the edge of the forest, so yeah, you can't see shit there at night. When he realized that stroller was empty he started to seriously panic, but then he heard sobbing coming from the forest and rushed towards it, where he found his wife, weeping and wandering between the trees in nigh unconscious state. Failing to get any sort of response from her, he just put her in his car and drove towards the precinct. My grandpa had nearly as much success. She was answering slowly, couldn't even recall her own name at first. She was clearly in a state of shock, so doctor was called in immediately. But something my grandfather did learn, by basically asking her the same questions over and over again. To sum her incoherent speech up, this is what happened. She was walking along that very same road when something big rushed towards her from the direction of an apartment complex, pushed her away, grabbed her child from a stroller and ran towards an iron tower and then into the woods. She followed this something to the forest but failed to catch up with it. Also, yes, this is exactly how she called it, something that my grandfather remembered very well. After that, there was a theory about a big animal, but I'll tell you about it later. The doctor, who arrived by then, examined her, finding bruises and small scratches, that she probably received while pursuing the abductor through the woods. No further damage was found, but she was indeed in a state of shock. Doctor advised to give her some glycine, or glycerol. Hell if I know what I have written in my notes there, don't harass me about it. Let her have some sleep and advised to avoid stress. He chastised my grandfather for questioning her in such a state. He also advised to hospitalize her if her condition wouldn't improve on the next day. It was decided, without much hope, to conduct a search, while the trail was hot, with help of a cynologist and his dog. The Iron Tower was found pretty fast. 250 meters away from the spot stroller was found there was an overhead power line, which you can see on the attached photo. I actually found 2 of such towers there, but the second one is too far away, and there are some warehouses near it instead of forest, so I bet I got the right one. During the examination of the stoller, some strange things started to happen. Dog, long-haired German Shepherd, a huge male, saw that dog a few times in my childhood and it was indeed enormous, started to act erratic, growling at the house, pressing its tail, ignoring cynologist's commands. Who was pretty surprised by that behavior from an adult dog that never acted like that before. He was the one who proposed a theory about a large wild animal that might have caused dog, unfamiliar with hunting, to react that way. On the fabric that covered the stroller, there was a small torn gap no one paid much attention to. After all, it could have torn during its fall on the asphalt covered in small pebbles and pieces of broken glass, but my grandfather noted this anyway. Maybe he had some thoughts about it. No traces of blood were found inside the stroller or on the ground around it. They even double-checked it during the day. Nothing, but stroller was taken for an expertise anyway, which gave no results. When they finally reached the tower, despite the dog acting completely inadequate and outright refusing to pick up the trail, they started to ponder what to do next. There were no obvious tracks and dog wasn't helping. So the cynologist was dismissed, while operatives started to rummage through the nearest part of the forest with flashlights, just to clear their conscience, but to no avail. Another Russian Anon here. In OP's absence I will conclude the story. In the morning they have called the man whose child had gone missing, but he had reported that his wife had not become better, and that he was taking her to a hospital. She was sent to the loony bin for some time, but even after getting released she couldn't tell anything new. As if she had lost her memory. There was only one connection left, the man's friends. But, not to turn all this into one of the boring episodes of Criminal Russia, translator's note, a once popular TV show documenting all kinds of juicy crimes. In brief, it did not lead anywhere. And look for yourself, the businessman was small-time, to put it mildly, and no demands followed his disappearance. And what's so strange and scary about this story, might you think? The fact that in a month's time the same house had seen a similar case. 2 brothers, the elder was 10, the younger, 7, played behind the house, rummaging under the windows, hoping to find something interesting. The elder brother, naturally, was tasked by the parents to keep an eye on Junior. The rest is taken from the elder brother's testimony after his father had taken him to the Militsiya. It was a short while before 10 p.m., time to return home, when the elder brother had suddenly noticed that the younger brother was standing still and staring into a dark alcove under the first-floor balcony. You can see such alcoves on the photo here perhaps, it's even one of them. The elder brother tried calling the kid several times, but he did not react. Setting on his way to him, he froze in place when fur-covered paws appeared out of the alcove and dragged the child inside, and the kid did not make a single sound. How he had managed to spot the fur on the paws in the dark is an interesting question, as there were no street lamps there. At first the guy stood dead still and peered into darkness. For a moment he even thought he had seen big white eyes, something like that he certainly would never be able to see. And then dashed off as fast as he could back home to his father, who was sipping beer after long day's work, and he, having smacked the lad for lying, went looking for the younger son with a flashlight. He had examined every alcove but did not find anything at all, except a hole punched in a corner of one of them which, probably, lead to the basement of the house. But that hole was too narrow for an adult man, only a child could get through. Spoiler, that was obviously supposed to be PT6, I fucked up. Spoiler. But the father wasn't intent to give up so easily. He took a crowbar, busted the lock on the basement door and climbed down there. Unfortunately, having gone through the entire basement, he had found nothing. There was a strong stink of rot, that was verified by grandfather who examined the cellar later, and something else in the air, a strange, almost heavy smell, although grandfather could smell nothing of that kind. But in the end nothing was found. That's all, folks. Funny thing is I knew that boy from my childhood. We were in the same crowd, he was slightly older than me, and the story he told to the Militsiya is nearly a perfect fit for what he told us after those events. He never was a particularly merry fellow and soul of the company, but after those events he barely went out, became somewhat fearful and almost panicked when faced with the backside of his own house, flat out refusing to go there. So, on one hand, I personally believe it, but on the other, who knows what a story a child can concoct. But there is the matter of the woman's account, who, again, was in a state of shock and thus made a shitty witness, and of a guard dog who would put its tail between its legs as like a little puppy, which is highly atypical. The animal version is doubtful, I'd say. Firstly, what kind of animal likes to snatch little kids without leaving any tracks? Seriously, 2 similar cases in the same place, and in a whole month nobody saw anything. And secondly, if we take into account the hole leading to the cellar, no large animal would fit into it. There are, of course, the man's friends from the first case, but as I said, there's just no sense in it for them, since the second man had nothing to do neither with commerce nor with crime, and it would make more sense to steal both children, I reckon. So, truth to be told, I have no ideas to share about this one. Unfortunately, that's all there is. The Anon with the investigator grandfather was never heard from again. Yeah, I figured. Try to fix a fuck up. Only to fuck up again.
Sorry for taking so long, I had class and legends from Galicia are surprising hard to find. I'll do more research once I get home and onto my PC in 7 hours or so, but in the meantime enjoy this messy thing I found about Babia Gora, which is in the western part of Galicia and in the center of southern Poland. Babia Gora, the highest point in the Beskidi Mountains, 1,725 meters above sea level, along with Diablik, TN, Devil's Peak, roughly, its strangely named peak that always seems to be shrouded in fog, has borne witness to many spine-chilling events. Maybe it's because according to legends, Babia Gora was the place of witches' Sabbaths, which is where it gets its name. TN, Baba means woman or crone. Meanwhile, Diablik was home to a demonic castle, the only present remnant of which is a massive pile of stones. In the area, crossroads are traditionally called pitchforks. Mysterious plane catastrophes. In the summer of 1963, on a clear and beautiful day, a helicopter crashed into Babia Gora. The pilot and passengers died. The cause of the crash was never determined. In 1969 a plane crashed into the side of the mountain. Rangers recovered 53 bodies from the wreck. Nobody on board survived. It's been suggested that the flight instruments failed and the pilot, flying in the fog, didn't see the mountain. But this explanation is not entirely satisfactory. Journeys to the nightmare world of mountains are always dangerous. Nobody in their right mind journeys to the Alps or Pyrenees without proper equipment, boots, and clothing, yet some Polish tourists have ventured forth without exercising even basic safety precautions. One of the trips to Babia Gora that ended in an unfortunate and unlikely way was a group of tourists from Silesia, who on a June evening took a stroll towards the peak, the ladies in nice shoes and light dresses and the men in just shirts and no jackets. They were halfway to the shelter when the air cooled rapidly and it began to snow. With near zero visibility, the freezing tourists decided to take shelter underneath a rock overhang, as they couldn't walk farther. They yelled for help. The rangers were alerted after a few hours. After a difficult search, they managed to find the stupid group, but some of them had already frozen to death. One of the men who had been calling for help had frozen with his mouth open, his frozen vocal cords making not a sound. One winter a group of 4 skiers was surprised by a sudden change of the weather and falling darkness. The host of the shelter in Markowiecki was worried by their long absence and organized a search. On the morning of the 3rd day, near Kościołki, a pair of women's skis without poles were found, and later a pair of men's skis, also without poles. After many hours, somebody spotted one of the skiers frozen in the snow. He had not taken off his skis and had frozen in a snowdrift some 24 meters below the shelter. 130 meters away, the body of the second skier, a 19-year-old girl, was found buried under the snow. 100 meters from the shelter, the body of the second girl was found. The body of the last skier wasn't found until mid-May, in a dense patch of forest, 200 meters from a forest ranger's hut. Bisazadi, have you been where the devil says goodnight? Have you ever been in the Bisazadi mountains? If not, you should be sorry, as it is still an area of wild and uncorrupted nature. And the mountains, called Polonini, though they look gentle, are not easy for inexperienced hikers. People say that in the 70s a black horse used to wander around the wetlands Kapolonina. People, though there aren't many of them in the area, would smack their lips at it, wanting to feed it bread. The horse would whinny, run away a bit and stop, waiting for the people to follow. Those who did would lose the trail and fall into holes, twisting their ankles. Then the horse would dissolve onto the fog. How is it possible that this part of Poland lacks fantastical names, with one exception, Smolnik? TN, derived from tar, Bisazadi comes from Bis meaning devil. It's possible that Bis was the one taking the shape of the horse. No bully, I typed this whole thing on my phone. Anyway, here's another source. There are several theories as to the source of the name of the mountain. One of the most famous legends of the area states that the mountains are piles of stones gathered by a giantess for her garden. Another, much more romantic story, talks about the lover of a bandit, who was so full of sorrow after his death that she turned to stone. Another story claims that the baby, women, that the name refers to were women kidnapped by bandits as wives, and kept in one of the area's caves. A bandit also appears in the story of the Devil's Castle, which is supposed to explain the origin of the peak Diabolic. It was on that peak that a great bandit decided to build his castle, and he hired the devil himself to do it. The devil, having signed a deal with the bandit, set to work and was almost done, but when he placed the keystone and the entire castle collapsed, crushing the bandit and allowing the devil to take his soul. Some say that during a storm any traveler foolish enough to be at the site can hear unsettling noises coming from underneath the ruins. It was also here that witches were supposed to meet for their Sabbath, although the Holy Cross Mountains are more frequently associated with them. The Germans also suspected the peak of having a demonic origin, formerly calling it the Devil's Mountain. Hey, just saying that I appreciate the stories. Feels like old/x/ is back. Also, I remembered this story from a thread long past about Russia. The thread is here x-thread archive link, and the story is supposedly from Arkhangelsk. Commence reposting in next post. Sup/x/. Do you know anything about taiga near Arkhangelsk? I bet first images popping in your head are swamps, cranberry and Lomonosov. But I will tell you this tale I remembered while I was messing with old papers. I have weird habit to store everything, from letters to invoices, like an archive without any goal. Fortunately I have enough time to format it well. I was rereading old letters from my aunt living in countryside near Arkhangelsk. I went there when I was much younger, and ever since then. Actually last time it was 3 years ago, was called to help my aunt moving to another house, but it didn't happen, so I was just messing around and drinking with locals. In exchange for good authentic moonshine they got grateful listener of various countryside stories. One of them, named D.E.D. Lichik, aka Nikolai Lukic, although old and heavy drinker, kept his mind fresh and memories clear. D.E.D. Lichik was born in such a heart of the country, there was no electricity, no council, not even a church. The place was called Lower Vojvodina. You will never find it in documents, like hundreds of similar villages. Local scribes were driven crazy from loads of toponyms down there, from the fact that many villages had identical names, so they recorded localities all at once with new names, like Filomonovsko settlement. People, though, kept calling their villages with original names, driving authorities crazy once more. Delichik was willing to talk about his homeland. Lower Vojvodina was an old village near a river, but the river eventually shallowed and turned into swamp. All that left was logging, berries and shrooms, and peat extraction. Several times a year came carts with news, salt, matches etc. Nothing extraordinary at all. But when I asked about Upper Vojvodina, logically speaking there must be one, Lichik told me the story. Upper Vojvodina was ruined by Mishits long ago, under Tsars. Local fool went looking for moss to fill gaps in his log house, but he brought back Mishits. According to Lichik it looked like ordinary moss from swamps, but shaded blue and smelled like monhe. If locals stumbled upon small patches of Mishits, they collected it, dried and sold to Ninets and Komayaki, and if they happened to find large clearing with Mishits, they marked it around 100 feet distance. Apparently it doesn't grow that much, so old markings served well. Those who went to these clearings never returned. As I have been told, must any animal, or livestock, or human, go there, Mishits would give off either spores or gas that caused paralysis. And in Upper Vojvodina, that guy covered his house in Mishits. Next year it was found out, that people of Upper Vojvodina either did not recognize Mishits, or they couldn't burn that house quickly enough. Or, as I think now, they didn't want to. People from wagons told about this to guys in Lower Vojvodina, and when they came, all they saw was log cabins, covered in Mishits, and thick smell of monhe. The place was burned, besieged with deadwood and furrow. Authorities didn't care about locals' businesses, locals themselves took it as another harshness of life. Road to Upper Vojvodina was dug up, tried not to go that way ever since, and also not to graze cattle here. Things were still just like they were before, naturally, if not that one case, that Delichik happened to witness. After WW2, 3 geologists came with carts. Well, maybe it's not geology, they were examining terrains around for industrial peatland development. I will keep calling them geologists. Townfolk hosted them at Luka's house, father of Lichik. Next day geologists went to swamps, refused to take a guide with them. They can be forgiven, as I've been told, locals were not the nicest and most hospitable people. The only thing that they've been told was not to go near Upper Vojvodina if they want to come back. They've been told this story, but geologists decided that locals tried to hide something there from Soviets. So they got their bags, instruments, and went straight to the ashes. Locals decided not to talk them out. On the third day one of the geologists was found at the edge of the village. Someone went looking for missing pig, but found poor guy instead. Tattered by branches, covered in blue moss and absolutely blind, he found his way out of the swamp by touch. People were called to find others, Lichik went with them, he was 10 years old by then. And yet after almost 70 years he was telling about how his father was washing Mishits out with kerosene. He told women to heat a bath and leave the guy there. Men, armed with kerosene, stakes, and ropes, went rescuing other explorers. They arrived at the ashes after half a day of walking. First thing they noticed was smell, then they saw a grayish-blue carpet-like clearing of Mishits, surrounded by ring of dry grass. Lichik vividly described the clearing, depressingly calm and smooth, except for 2 maybe bumps or what looked like tree broken in half. The one that was bigger was wiggling a bit. Men pulled him off with the rope, no mistake, it was one of geologists, pretty much had found what was hid from him. The guy was still alive, croaking through crust of moss, tightly covering his body even under his clothes. He was dragged from Mishits, men tried to clear up his face. To do that, they needed to rip out small roots of Mishits from his skin. After layer of moss was off his mouth, he started to sound more distinctly. Geologists tried to say something. All that Delichik got was God in the swamp, there's God's light, let me back to God. Then geologist suddenly tried to get up, felt, tried to crawl but subsided before men could do anything. Later he was burned right there. The guy who got back on his own survived, though losing his eyes and one of the legs was cut off by Luca. The moss got in his boot and gnawed the flesh. In a month car came for geologists, they were told what happened, guided to the place. After another month military came, on trucks. Military stayed there, and locals were loaded into trucks and evacuated first in Pliscy, where Plisetsk spaceport is now, and then were resettled in the south of the region, told not to talk too much about it. Solichik got in Ants village, got a job in Lesbromaz, and then retired to make moonshine and tell stories. So there it is. Maybe DED made it all up, but that was a good story for me. Sure, I think I've done some Indonesian spooky stories a while back. Hold on while I pick one from a local chan that might be going down. Right, this is the first one I saw, a recent one. B-Strands driver, some kind of minibus taxi service. 3 to 4 years ago. Driving late at night, airport, Bandung, city, route. There was one passenger, they woke up at about the 90th kilometer, made small talk. From the edge of the eye saw that she was a beautiful woman, sitting near the driver's seat at the first row. Asks me in Sundanese, "Where did you come from, sir? Where's your wife from? How many kids?" Typical small talk. Speaks politely, softly. At the end spoke, "Children are lent by God, please take care of them." At 100 km, near Tiger Head Rock, a very local landmark I guess, she wanted to be dropped off. Try to prevent, since it's around the middle of nowhere at midnight, but she said there's already someone waiting for her. For some reason agree and stops the car. Passenger opens door and gets out. Also gets out to get her baggage, maybe she got some, and make sure she gets picked up by the supposed escort/pickup. Nothing near vicinity of car. In only 3 seconds, the passenger that got dropped vanishes, at the edge of the highway, open place so no cover. Impossible for her to run to nearest tree, which is about 100 meters away, or cross the highway, which would be visible, no other car that stopped nearby, nobody to pick her up. Even checked under own car, nothing. Cold sweat.jpg. The remaining passenger, who turns out to be a dude, knocks on the window and asks what's the problem. Explains about the other passenger that got out and disappeared. "Law, but I'm the only passenger here, sir." Dude passenger explains he saw that I, the driver, was talking to myself. Thought I was on the phone, but no handphone or hands-free. Continue the route when everything's sure. The driver told that he's grateful the lady passenger was good. Imagine what happens if she's naughty and plays with the steering wheel while on the road. In Java, most ghost/spirit/supernatural entity is called mamiti, which means that which makes scares. So ghosts, spirits, jinns, basically things that go bump in the night, all could be called mamiti. One of these is the glundung pringis, glundung equals rolling, pringis equals grinning, which fits as its form is a decapitated, grinning head. Now this story was told to me by a SMP, junior high school, friend. Befriend at grandpa's house at night. Almost durian season, grandpa has a durian plantation out in his backyard. Suddenly hear something hitting the roof. Repeated thudding through the night. Grandpa says it's just the ripe durian falling. But wait, there's no trees close enough for it to hit the roof. Go out to check. Right when he got out, something fell right in front of him after thudding on the roof. It's a decapitated head with a durian-eating grin. In a split second, it turns into a durian. So yeah, apparently the glundung pringis can switch places with round objects, durian, coconut, a ball, and roll on its own power. Apparently it's named glundung pakak in Blitar, still in Java. If you folks are interested, I can try and translate some of the stories from Yakutia, a far eastern region of Russia, known for consisting mostly of primal forests that never saw a man and severe weather conditions. The natives have a rich folklore and a fair amount of all kinds of creepy stories. The first story is about the hypothetical local underwater spirits, Shilicuns. The native Yakut faith is a classical paganism. Each area and each important sphere of activity is teeming with spirits which are responsible for it. However, after Yakutia became part of the Russia in the 17th century, the local beliefs were to some extent assimilated with the Orthodox Christianity and underwent considerable changes, and gained theistic elements. Nevertheless, nature spirits did not go to anywhere. One kind of them are so-called Shilicuns. It is believed that they live underwater most of the time in various water bodies and do not interact with people in any way. Traditional Yakut belief does not consider them evil, however you couldn't call them particularly kind either. Their appearance is not described in detail, but they are usually imagined as water imps, anthropomorphous, with some fish features. Say hello to Lovecraft's Innsmouth. So, about a meeting with Shilicuns. They get out from underwater only once in a year, during the Christmas tide. Normally, they only leave at night to gather in any abandoned houses and shacks, away from settlements, and play cards with each other there, lol. They bet their own underwater money, looking similar to gold coins. People brave or foolish enough are to go to an empty house on the day of Christmas tide and hide under a table or elsewhere, and cover themselves with fabric. Of course, it is necessary to dress up properly, as empty houses, naturally, are not heated, and January temperatures, translators note, Orthodox Christmas is on January 7th, easily reach -50 degrees Celsius. If you are in luck, the house will indeed serve as a game parlor to a party of local Shilicuns. As Shilicuns gather and the betting pool increases, one must shout as loudly as one can and knock the table over. Frightened Shilicuns will bail and leave their money, lol again. Only, it has to be spent within 3 days. After that, gold of Shilicuns will turn into seaweed from which it came. But material enrichment is not the only reason to stalk out a Shilicun meeting. During the game they are far from silent and actively discuss future events and the fate of people living nearby, so if you do not spoil their party and listen carefully, it is possible to get a hold of valuable information on the future and on your family. It is one of classical local Christmas fortune-telling customs, but I, for one, do not compute how fucked up in the head one has to be to go alone to an empty house on a -50 degrees night and spend it there waiting for supernatural creatures. And now the actual cool story that I was told in my childhood and that made me lose sleep at night. A paradox, it has no direct relation to Shilicuns, but it was necessary to explain them in order to get the sense of the story. So, Central Yakutia, January, Christmastide, severe frosts. Two strong young brothers decide to go to listen to Shilicuns and, if luck is on their side, get a hold of a tidy sum of money. Since people take Christmastide fortune-telling seriously around these parts, various girls' fortune-telling on wax, mirrors and needles, of course, do not count. They told nobody about their plan, even their parents. They chose an empty old hut on a glade near their village. Such buildings are common in Yakutia. People used to live with their whole families on separate glades. In the evening, having wrapped themselves in the warmest clothes they could find and having taken a couple of bottles of vodka, the brothers left for their destination. The mood was good. Together they thought they had nothing to fear, having gotten used to cold. Generally, all was well. Having arrived to the place, they climbed under a shabby table as was called for, and covered themselves with a thick blanket. They sit, talk about this and that in hushed whispers, sipping vodka from time to time. Lighting a fire was a no-no, as Shilicuns would get spooked and wouldn't come. Moonlight would have to do. By the way, old Yakut houses, such as this one, are conjoined to a bar, with a single door standing between them, so that people wouldn't freeze their balls off going via the street in winter. And so the brothers were sitting there for several hours. It was already after midnight, both were already rather tight-lipped and sleepy. And then barn's door began to creak. Brothers got tense, shilakans began to gather, they thought. But then everything went silent, then again the door began to creak, this time louder, the sound clearly indicative of the door slowly opening. And then a sound is heard from the barn, reminiscent of a chicken's clucking. It was here that the younger brother's nerves got the better of him, as he shouted on the top of his lungs, jumped out from under a table and rushed to the exit. The elder brother, naturally, followed him. Only he was not so lucky. As the younger brother ran out of the house, the elder brother's leg got caught on a doorstep and he fell down near the entrance. He began to cry out for help, and almost immediately ceased, as if he was being choked, then shouted as though he was being burned alive. Younger brother could only run faster, shitting tons of bricks. His brother's screams didn't stop until he reached the edge of the glade. Having reached the edge of the woods, he looked back, but couldn't make anything out, as the shack was quietly standing in the moonlight. So, he dashed for about an hour before he reached his home village. At once he everything to his father, and got almost beaten down by him for being such a fool, as he should have at least inquired about the house where they were going before going there. It turned out a long time ago, before the revolution, that hut housed a family each member of which died in close succession without any obvious reasons. The commonly accepted explanation of that time was that an evil spirit gobbled them up. Since then nobody lived on that glade, even despite its fertile land. No shilakans, of course, would party in such a place. They are not exactly evil after all, but someone else would be very likely interested in two fuckwits that came to the on the darkest hour. Anyway, the father with the younger brother quickly gathered up, got in their car and raced to the hut. They reached it quickly, and the father was berating his son for leaving his brother behind for the entirety of the road. Everything seemed quit when they arrived. The younger brother flat out refused to leave the car, and even his teeth began to shake. So the father had to venture into the damned place alone. The elder brother laid on snow exactly where he fell, face down. Traces on the snow indicated that he didn't move much and died in the same pose as he fell down. The body had stiffened due to the cold. The father already began to sob. There was nothing left to do, so they put his body in the car and went home. Back home, when they took off all multiple layers of his clothes, it turned out that on his back, under a right shoulder blade, there was a huge bruise as if someone had hit him with a huge fist right through all the layers of clothes. Later the younger brother has told of what he saw right before he ran away. When the barn door once again began to creak, he raised the blanket a little and saw under moonlight a 3-meter tall black human-shaped silhouette moving their way, so he screamed and dashed away. I don't know what you are talking about, take note that I am not the original OP, so maybe you are confused. Another Yakut story that frightened me in the childhood. According to stories, it happened in the Soviet time in Tatinsky district in a small village in broad daylight. The storyteller, let's call him Semyon, was a local farmer and was walking back home from a day of haymaking on a regular summer evening. The dirt road went through some barren grounds. It was sunny and hot. By the way, the summer heat in Yakutia is no less inhuman than the winter frost. The temperature seldom falls below 30 degrees Celsius. And sometimes reaches 40, the absolute difference of temperatures at different times around the year being around 100 degrees. Semyon's walking merrily, singing something quietly, and then spots 3 figures headed his way on the road ahead. The one who in the center is pretty tall, the others somewhat shorter. Semyon then pegged them as an adult and 2 of their children. He wondered who it could be and came to a conclusion that it must be an Akitan with his sons from Semyon's village and didn't pay them much mind. But when the figures approached closer, he noticed that the figures at the sides weren't children at all, they were only a little bit shorter than the central figure. Then Semyon noticed that the outlines of the figures were very strange. They wore identical gray clothes, and the heavy figures hidden under these clothes widened closer to earth, looking something like a bottle. He did not see any legs and did not understand how they managed to move at all. Semyon was not frightened right away. At first he kept going, until he noticed their big black eyes on white as snow faces, and his face got almost warped out of sheer horror. He then remembered that, according to the Yakut beliefs, when meeting abaki, that is various evil spirits, one must never just run away, or they might give chase and even murder you right there and then. See the previous pasta, for example. In about 20 steps ahead there was a fork in the road, and Semyon made it his plan reach the fork before the bottle people and to just walk away from them. But the fear so held down it that it literally forced itself to go with a mouse speed forward. He was so afraid that he had to literally force himself to walk forward, towards the bottle people. Looking at the faces of those beings was almost too much for him, but every time he lowered his head it seemed to him that they were just about to snatch him up, and his eyes automatically came back up. As he remembered it, all three looked almost identical, as if without a drop of blood, with big black eyes that were only ever looking forward, and with the heavily deformed figures which became wider in the lower parts. They differed only in their height. It's from a Russian counterpart to Wyoming incident, the word became sort of a meme. Insert YouTube link here. At last, Semyon reached the fork and curtailed on a footpath. At that time the distance between him and the beings was only about a dozen meters. Trying his best not to run, he followed the footpath, keeping a corner of his eye on the walkers. To his great relief, they passed him without even turning their heads. Having put some decent distance between them and himself, Semyon started to run and ran all the way to his home. On his way he turned around a few times and noticed the silhouettes of the bottle people in the distance of the dark road. As it turned out, he was not the only one who saw them. Several village people noticed this trinity top and got really spooked. They decided that the three had no interest in their village and were only passing by on their way to somewhere else. This story, according to the legend, occurred in one of the central regions of Yakutia. In the late 70s a certain Anon lived in a small village near the regional center. He was 10 at the time, and was friends with the neighbor's boy Vazia. One morning he woke up and, as always, went to the neighbor's home to play to his friend, but Vazia's mother told him that Vazia got sick and therefore he will not be able to play. Anon went back home, and the following morning his mother told him Vazia passed away. As he was told, the boy suddenly got a terrible headache. Vazia's parents tried to self-medicate all day long and only sent for the doctor to the regional center in the evening. There was only one female doctor in the village, and she was only good for common cold and commonplace injuries. By then the kid was already in a grave condition. The local doctor forbade to transport him anywhere. Therefore Vazia's father left on his car for the city as quickly as he could to bring the doctor back, opting not to wait for an ambulance. "Thanks, Anon. I want to someday. I don't really pay much mind to politics." They returned late at night, both white as chalk. It turned out that when went back through the woods, about 5 km from our village, in a rear-view mirror they saw a headless man pursuing them through the moonlight. They saw it both, Vazia's father, and the doctor. They couldn't make out any details from the distance, but both claimed that it was abnormally tall. Even without a head it reached 2.5 meters. Vazia's father put the pedal to the metal, and their terrible pursuer was soon left behind. Having calmed down, the doctor gave Vazia some shots, administered a dropper, ordered to build a stretcher and to carefully bring him to the regional center. The boy died on the way there. It was said that halfway to the city before dying, he, for a short while, half came to his senses. He could not speak, but kept raising his right hand and pointing a finger somewhere backwards. Remembering their recent encounter, the adults cautiously peered into the night behind car, but saw nothing. Several minutes later the boy died. And this, my dear Anons, is not pasta, for it happened to me personally. I was a part of school students group from that same class. Perhaps, at least so far, the only really spooky case in my life. After finishing the 9th grade, translator's note, Russian schools have 10 to 11 grades, so 9th would be something like beginning of high school, and having passed the state exams, all class went hiking to the countryside. We got a teacher to come with us and picked a place, a small glade about 15 kilometers from the city, with a small river and a small clean pond. We were spending time rather cheerfully by playing volleyball, eating until we were full, and some of the guys were secretly drinking beer they smuggled to the trip. Closer to evening, when it began to get dark, we gathered around a campfire and began to tell each other creepy stories. By the time when we were to go to sleep, we all already were in such state that we would scream nervously from each rustling leaf. Several guys went to an edge of the woods to take a piss some distance away from the rest of us. I began climbing into the tent when they came running back with eyes wide open and raised hell in camp. Thanks, I saved all of it to my special creepypastas collection. Albeit I will probably save the original versions for reference. According to their account, that's what happened. Approaching an forest edge, they suddenly saw a person hiding behind a tree and carefully looking their way from there. They could not see his face clearly in the twilight, but had assumed that someone from the class children decided to play a prank on their expense after all the creepy stories. They began it to shout, "Come out, we can see you." The person hiding would retract his face behind the tree and then poked his head from the other side of the tree. It took them some time to notice that every time the faces would appear higher and higher, soon it was already at the height of 4 to 5 meters. And that tree was devoid of any big enough branches to climb onto. The children, naturally, got seriously spooked and ran back to us. We did not believe them right away. Who knows, maybe they decided to play a prank on us. So all the crowd went to examine that tree. We did not approach the forest edge, but the white spot flashing behind a tree trunk was seen by everybody. And it was rising up and then jumping down, almost all the way to earth. Some girls began to cry out of fear. Teachers ordered us to quickly get in the cars, and we went back to the city in the middle of the night. By the way, despite the abundance of spirits of everyone and everything in the nature, there is no such concept as Leshii or his analog in the Yakut faith. Translator's note, Leshii is an old pagan deity, guardian of the forest that sometimes leads travelers astray. There is Bayanai spirit patron of hunting, and it is said one can meet it in the woods. There is a shitload of brick-shitting inducing legends and tales of such meetings, but it is not particularly similar to the Leshii, and ranks higher too. Bears would sometimes be called Leshii, Tyataji, in Yakutia. Perhaps, the Leshii is simply not needed in Yakut mythology, as any area, any part of the woods, any mountain, any lake, etc. Everything already has its own spirit patron. These entities, I must say, are not known for their niceness and can and will strongly punish the Arai traveler if he does not follow local customs. Sometimes even physically. For example, in Yakutia it is strictly forbidden, when in a new to yourself, or deserted area, to say its name out loud. It is considered a grave offense to the local spirit. You may laugh, but the author was very nearly slapped by his parents in the childhood during one trip for reading roadside signs with the name of the area out loud. This rule is strictly observed even today, and were you to violate it, everyone would squint at you from a safe distance. I would too, most likely. It is one thing to laugh at dumb yokels from inside a cozy apartment, and radically another when you find yourself in 300 kilometers from civilization amidst deep eldritch woods, where anything's possible. There you have it. When entering especially sacred areas of Yakutia, by the roadway you are likely to find trees entirely covered with candy wrappers, coins and even banknotes. They are relatively abundant. I myself saw 5 of them in my life. It is called Keryah, a sacred tree. If you want to cross the sacred area untouched by unknown powers, you must offer tribute, leave any wrapper, coin, or a banknote on a tree. Actually, at present this rule is not too strictly observed. Even if you leave nothing, nothing will become of you, provided you broke no other rules. And if you were to somehow offended the tree or, even worse, collected its gifts for yourself, then that's it, be ready to wear a target on your back for the local spirits. The first case happened during the late Soviet times, sometime around the 80s. Some bigwig from the regional center, we will call him Nikolai, went to visit the neighboring district, accompanied only by the driver of the car, who we will call Ivan. It was winter time, it was taking them a while, and before long it was dark. Entering some glade they noticed one such decorated tree on their left. Of course, they knew what it was, but did not put any stock into local beliefs, and so they drove on, but not before the driver took a piss at the base of the tree. It's pitch black around, only light circle from headlights could be seen on the snow-covered road. And suddenly Ivan noticed that the sound of the car's engine changed notably, as the car had sunk in slightly and began to lose speed. He presses the gas pedal, the motor roars, but the car doesn't go faster than creeping speed. That's when Nikolai the bigwig asks it, and why did it smell of rot inside the car? Ivan shtugs at first, but then, looking back, shits bricks as he spots a lean Yakut, dressed in decrepit fur clothes, looking back at him with mean intent. He froze with fear, remembering what he did to the tree, while still driving the car forward automatically. Nikolai asked him in what was wrong, and Ivan only nodded back, unable to a word more. The chief took a gander back and shut up right there and then. The stench was growing stronger, the car was creeping ever slower, like a turtle, as if the passenger on a back seat weighed at least several centners. Translator's note, centner is 100 kilograms, both people in the car were whiter than chalk. But had no wish to stop the car in the middle of a deserted glade. And so they drive on. Driver glances at the rear view mirror, but there nothing is reflected there, an empty back seat. But once he turns to look back, he is hit with the same stench, as if their passenger died and started decomposing 2 weeks ago, and yet still pierces the driver with his sunken eyes. As fear grows, the driver doesn't dare to look back again and keeps his eyes on the road. They drove for about an hour, until they reached the settlement on their way. When the lights of the houses were close, the driver felt how the car suddenly went easier. Having taken courage, he turned back. There was nobody at the back seat. Letting out a sigh of relief, he tugged at Nikolai, and they both exhaled. But the stench did not disappear at once, they even had to slightly open windows to let the smell out quicker. Later they would both pledge to honor all the traditions from now on to never again find themselves in such a horror. Here's the second case. This took place somewhere around the 60s. Some no fucks given kinda guy leaves for the Amga district from Yakutsk. He was Russian, by the way, not a Yakut. His reason for going to Amga was that a buddy of his promised to employ him at the local collective farm, since he failed to find a job in the city, and lost all his money on gambling too. He hitched a ride to some point, and then went further on foot, following a small country road. It was early summer, no mosquitoes yet, it was warm and bright, and he had some food and vodka in his backpack. Life was good. And so we have our hero, minding his own business, when he notices near some glade by the road a big branchy tree covered by all kinds of multicolored rags. Naturally, he has no clue of what it was. At first he was only slightly amused, but then, as he got closer, my God, there were all kinds of coins and banknotes just lying in a heap under it. Without a second thought, he collected everything he could, the sum was quite good for the time, put it into his pockets and went on ahead in a terrific mood. By the evening he reached an empty hut amidst a glade. He laid his own jacket atop the bed, drank some vodka and went to sleep. You're going, man, I'm reading, man. Don't give up. It did not take him long to feel that someone was pulling at his leg. He tries to pay it no mind, but to no avail, as the pulling grows stronger and stronger. He jumps up, looks around, no one, only a light summer night, an empty house, an empty glade. So he lays down again. As soon as he is starting to drift off to sleep, pulling begins again, just like before. This time he rose, swearing, ran out of the house and around the hut, but found no one yet again. Half asleep, our hero did not feel any fear. So he went to bed again, turning to the other side. At first he could not fall asleep for some time. As soon as he managed to, he was pulled so strongly that it fell out of the bed, and was even dragged a little on floor. But when he opened his eyes, he still couldn't see anyone. This kept happening all night long. The guy tried to fall asleep, and someone did not allow him to do it. Finally, at daybreak after another pull, he opened his eyes and rose, and saw in the morning twilight a black silhouette of the large person of the powerful build standing over him and holding him by the leg. Here nerves gave out, he jumped up from the bed, and, shouting at the top of his lungs, ran out from the house and kept running without looking forward blindly. Only later did he understand that left the backpack in the hut, but could not gather enough courage to come back for it. He ran all morning, until he reached a village, knocked on the door of a random house there and told the people about his troubles. He was advised to return to the tree and put all the money back where he found it. He remembered that he still had the money on him in a pocket, reached down, and found a hole, that everything fell out of while he was running away. He, of course, did not intend to return, and continued his journey to Amga accompanied by a local.